Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the nature of love, evolutionary love, and specifically Eros and Agape. With me is Adam Crabtree, who is the author of Evolutionary Love and the Ravages of Greed. He is also the co-author of a fabulous anthology called Irreducible Mind and the co-editor of a companion anthology called Beyond Physicalism. Some of his other titles include Memoirs of a Trance Therapist, Hypnosis and the Evocation of Human Potential, and From Mesmer to Freud, Hypnotic Sleep and the Roots of Psychological Healing. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you.
To begin with, thinking about love, I've already introduced the word agape,
yes,
which is a Greek word, and many of our viewers will understand it, but some will not. So let's begin by defining that word.
Okay. I thought that the best way to talk about my new book is in three propositions. This is kind of a thumbnail sketch. And the first one includes defining agape. And that the first part of this is to say that there are two kinds of love abroad in the universe, agape and eros. And agape is the love that desires the full development and reaching the greatest potentials for the loved one, or the love object. It's a selfless love. It's a benevolent love. It's an empathic love. It's a love with no strings. It's a love with nothing in it for the lover, but all for the loved one. Eros, on the other hand, is the other kind of love, and that love desires the love object, desires that object because it has qualities that it finds valuable. It wants to be enriched by the love object. It wants to grow through interaction with the love object. It wants to evolve and become more through encounter with the love object. And so here with Eros, the lover grows. The lover is very much involved as opposed to agape. Yeah. And the growth of the lover is central. And it's the love of desire for the love object.
Now, these are Greek words.
They are.
Are they? I don't know. So these ideas have been around in Western culture for thousands of years.
That's right.
I presume when you talk about agape, it sounds very similar to what we often think of as platonic love.
It is, because it does, platonic love we usually think of as not having a sense of desire in it, not having a sexual dimension to it. And actually, that's one thing about Eros as I use it. It's not equivalent to sexual love or even intimate love in that sense, a physical sense. It's this broader thing of being enriched by whatever means by the love object. And that could be emotional means. It could be if you could love something for the fact that you learn from it. So it could have any number of ways that a person is enriched by that encounter.
It has the element of desire.
Very definitely, because the lover desires something of value from the loved one.
As opposed to agape, which seems to be free of desire.
It is free of desire for the self, for the lover. It's all desire for the good growth and evolution of the love object or the loved one.
Now, I know in your book you refer to agape as the conscience of Eros.
That's right. So that leads me to the second point. Thank you very much. The second point in this three-point thumbnail sketch is that in human relations and in human interactions, agape and eros are both involved. Rarely is it just one. Usually it's both. And what we need in our love interactions with other people is a balance between the two, the balance between agape and eros. And the important thing is that in those actions, agape must hold a place of primacy. It must always be the ultimate consideration in the love exchange. And if eros would take the primacy, then the enrichment of the lover becomes most important. And the primacy and agape is pushed aside, then we have what I call greed. Because greed is the desire for enrichment by the love object without regard to the welfare of that love object. See, agape is gone.
Yeah.
So there's the desire for the welfare and the growth of that love object is gone too. And that's, for me, the third point. The very definition of greed is where the primacy has been toppled in relationship to other people, but also to the world. I mean, you see the primacy of agape toppled if the environment is abused. So any way that the primacy of the development of the love object is pushed out is a problem.
So if I, for example, have a beautiful young wife and we grow old together, so she's no longer young and beautiful, and I discard her and find another young, beautiful lady to take up with, that would be an example of greed.
It could very well be. If indeed you are doing something that disregards your partner, your former partner, and makes her less than a human being in your eyes or less than a person, and let your own needs push that out so you don't take that into account. That's right. This is why I call agape the conscience of eros. Eros needs a conscience. It needs something to say, remember the good of the love object. Remember the importance that the love object can evolve and grow and fulfill itself.
Yeah. Well, you write about the conflicts that can occur in a relationship where one person needs space so that they can grow. They're fulfilling their potential. And the other person maybe desires more physical pleasure, but they're not getting it because the other person is busy satisfying their growth needs.
This is true. And here you could have a situation this is why moral decisions can be very complex, because all of the elements need to be taken into account.
Yeah.
Because people are together, it doesn't mean that that's the end of it, that there's nothing else to be thought about and they stay together for the sake of each other, because things change and people grow and circumstances alter, and it may be that for the good of both, a change is needed. But at least when you're considering a change, you have to take the welfare of both into account. Agape must stay there as a very important element.
Well, we live in a society where 150 years ago, divorce was considered a scandalous thing.
Yes.
As I recall, Ibsen wrote plays about divorce, and it was considered highly unusual and outrageous. And now today, it seems over 50% of marriages will result in divorce.
I think that's right, yes. Yes.
So there's a big change going on in the culture itself, at least Western culture, and perhaps beyond that, with regard to these concepts of agape and eros.
Yes, and I think that is partly the fact that people are more aware of self-development, of the growth of their potentials, of following an important path in their life, of realizing themselves. People are more aware of that than they used to be, which is good.
Yeah.
But it has to be kept within that framework where agape still is the primary consideration in a human relationship. If you do something that's going to be destructive to the other person for some small gain in yourself, or even some more significant gain, if it's really harmful to the other person, then agape is being pushed aside. And that's a problem.
Yeah. So the two really can coexist.
Yes, and they must. Mm-hmm. In human life, we are always working from both. If you take an example, I was going to say that it's very rare that you have pure agape. Mm-hmm. But I think the closest thing to it might be the love that a person feels towards an infant. Mm-hmm. There, you feel this is a marvelous being. You want this being to grow and become whatever it can. You have the best wishes for it mm-hmm. and for its future. Mm-hmm. And there is no concern for yourself. You're not thinking, what am I going to get from this infant?
Right.
That's not at all involved. So it's pretty close to something like pure agape. Mm. But most often there's a mixture of other things too. Yeah. And that leads to the notion that I talk about in my book called custodial love. Mm-hmm. Now, that takes into account the fact that love needs to change, particularly when you're considering parental love mm-hmm. or love where you have responsibility for another person because they can't take care of themselves.
Right.
So that has to change over time. When you begin with the infant, that's almost pure agape, mm-hmm. almost pure evolutionary mm-hmm. love. Mm-hmm. But as the infant grows and becomes more of a person and can do a few things for him or herself, we allow them to do those things. We don't have to take care of everything now. Yeah. There's something that they're starting to take care of. And so our custodial position and duties say, well, we should give them a chance to mm-hmm. learn these things. We should give them a chance to grow. We can't stay in there looking after every detail now that isn't going to be good for them. Yeah. We need to allow them the space. Mm-hmm. So as the child grows, the child develops more and more abilities to do things for themselves, make their own decisions, and to grow in that way, mm-hmm. evolve. Parents have to be careful not to be behind the child. That is, still keeping them in an earlier phase mm-hmm. of development, to be with them where they actually are now, to give them the chance to move forward in the way they can with their present development. Mm-hmm. And as time goes on, when they come to adolescence, the rubber starts to hit the road, because there the parent has to start backing up and allow this person to become an adult. Mm-hmm. And insofar as they are learning things and developing skills and developing their own view of the world, the parent has to let them do it. Yeah. And there's always the temptation to say, well, no, here's the way to look at the world. Here's what you should be doing. Here's what you should be studying. Here's the girlfriend you should be mm-hmm. interested in, et cetera, et cetera.
And well, the same is true of spouses.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. This is true of spouses also. Yeah. We have to allow room to the other person. Mm-hmm. But where it's tricky with adults or custodial love is, for a while, no, we had to be the caregiver in very small things. Yeah. But here there has to be a change and an evolution of both. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the biggest challenges I've found in parenthood, is to do that, to stand back and to give the space mm-hmm. for the growing youngster to become an adult. Mm-hmm. And this is where a lot of conflicts occur, because sometimes the youngster wants to jump ahead into something they're really not ready for, mm-hmm. and there's a little dance that has to happen between the parent and the adult. So custodial love is a very important factor in our lives, but it's not easy. And it is complicated.
Now, a while back, you used the term evolutionary love and suggested that it is equivalent to agape.
Yes, that's right. Now, I was influenced in my thinking about this by reading a treatise by the philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce mm-hmm. called Evolutionary Love. That was the name of it. It was an article he wrote for a journal. Yeah. And in that, he talks about evolutionary love, and he uses the word agape, and he believes that that is the basic love that's at work in the whole universe. Mm-hmm. That is, that the universe has evolution of the universe has a driver, and that driver is evolutionary love. The drive and the wish that everything develop and evolve into the greatest possible realization of its potentials. Mm-hmm. The greatest realization of its potentials, not just human beings, not just living things, but of everything, because Peirce believed that the whole universe evolves. So that evolutionary love or agape is like an enabling condition that makes it possible for the universe to actually evolve.
Well, that seems quite consistent with what cosmologists call the anthropic principle,
yes.
that the entire universe was, at least our universe, was designed in such a way, all of the fine constants of physics, the fine structure constant, for example,
yep.
Are such that human life is possible.
Yes, that's right. There is this urge everywhere for evolution to happen. And evolving into human life is part of evolution. That's right. It's like there's a preparation for human beings to be here. And that's something that is like a kind of a metaphysical foundation of the universe, as opposed to the kind of its manifestation in human interactions. It's the same love, but it's on a very different level.
So since the anthropic principle is much more recent in our intellectual development than Peirce, who wrote over 100 years ago,
yes.
It's as if he is anticipating that.
Well, he is. And it's interesting. One thing that struck me when I read this little treatise, by the way, it's not that long, it's an article. It's so rich, and it has so many things that are important for understanding love, that I couldn't understand why it had been neglected. I couldn't find any place that people were talking about it, unless they're Peirce scholars who are discussing his work and his general philosophy.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me that the wisdom in understanding the world this way was being lost. And that's one of the reasons I wrote this book.
Well, he's suggesting then that agape is sort of a primordial principle that operates all across time and space.
That's exactly right, yes. Without it, we couldn't have this universe. There has to be that urge put into the universe to evolve. That's agape. But without it, we couldn't have, without Eros, we couldn't have this world.
Yeah.
Because Eros is the means by which evolution happens. It's the interaction by which one thing enriches the other, and another thing enriches the other, and things enrich each other as they evolve. So Eros plays an equally central role, but it's not foundational like agape, which is the very first thrust to say, evolve. This is the actual carrying out of that evolution in the concrete. That's Eros.
Well, that is fascinating. It reminds me of Francis Bacon's essay on Cupid.
Yes.
In which Bacon points out that there were two Cupids in mythology. One is the youngest of the gods, so that's the little baby Cupid with the bow and arrow that we know about, which is related to what we think of as Eros.
Yes.
And the other, according to Francis Bacon, was the oldest of the gods.
Right. Well, I see that. I believe that that's a good way of putting it, because Eros had to be there at the beginning too, or there would have been no evolution, because there had to be that interaction and that enriching of one by the other. Yeah,
I think Bacon writes that the older of the two Cupids was the oldest of the gods, but even before that god, there was chaos, and or the primordial soup, or the sometimes it's referred to as the green dragon from which everything emerged.
Okay. Yes. Well, this is I think that there's something in these mythological images. There's something true. A friend of mine, a philosopher, Robert Corrington, has developed a philosophy called that is ecstatic naturalism, and that it says he says that there is this unknowable depth of roiling creativity on the one hand, and then there's the world that it produces on the other hand, and in between are all the conditions that are needed for that creativity to become reality in existing things. And that's where I see Agape sits right in between the two. Agape is the first thing that's there to allow the urge for this world to come into being. And it takes in along with it, then it creates along with it Eros, so that the world can actually happen.
Now, we live at a time in which it seems as if the erotic impulse sometimes gets way out of hand, and it's coming to the surface more and more in the sense of sometimes it's called the Me Too movement.
Yes.
Women speaking out about aggressive assaults by men upon them, which seem to be, I don't know if that's Eros or if it's just pure power.
Well, it's Eros without conscience, is what it is. It's the desire to be enriched in some way or other, enriched in the sense of there's something I feel I'm going to get from this, some movement forward that I'm going to get to this, for this, whether it's pleasure or something else, power, but it has no conscience. And so that to me is the very definition of greed. It's Eros without conscience, Eros without restraint, which takes no account to what is being done to the object of that.
And I recall you citing Charles Sanders Peirce writing at the end of the 19th century, in which he was lamenting that this century has been filled with so much greed. Greed has risen to the surface of things to such an extent that the next century, the 20th century, will have to pay a terrible price because of 19th century greed.
That's what he says. And it's amazing how he said that by the end of the 20th century, we'll see the outcome of this. And it'll be a disaster. And that's what I believe that's what we're seeing. I believe that right now, in the early 21st century, we have a disaster of greed cascading into the world and producing terrible things. Among other things, greed produces division automatically, because you have to see yourself seeking your own pleasure and your own power and whatever it may be at the expense of another. So you have to see that other as not worth not being valuable in itself or in herself or himself. And that division, it's like the division between oneself and the other becomes something you can use, not a person, but something you can use for your own enhancement. And we see so much of that. You see it in politics. Politics is, in my opinion, getting to look very bad. I mean, politicians are not very attractive anymore. Like being a politician is not attractive as a vocation or something ideal that people used to want to fulfill or become involved in.
Well, I have to say this, since we're getting into that.
Yes.
I've been a lifelong liberal myself, and I maintain faith that liberal politicians are interested in the general welfare of society, that they are striving to create social conditions that will enable everybody to thrive. That's my view, that they are less corrupted because they have an attitude of agape towards culture itself.
That's what one would hope. And actually democracy was set up to sort of allow agape expression. Equality, everybody we want to prosper. We want everybody to realize themselves. No matter what their stage of development, no matter what their level of society, we want them to prosper.
And financial prosperity is not what I mean primarily. I mean prosperity of the soul, which is the very purpose of this video.
Yes, absolutely. No, it is not at all just financial prosperity. Democracy, I think, was made to raise and enhance people in every possible way.
But yes, if I may say, you are a former priest, and I have heard you say you believe the church itself has become corrupted by greed.
Well, yes. I mean, I grew up in the Catholic Church, and in my local experience of the Catholic Church in a small town in Minnesota, I found what the church meant to me and what religion meant to me was fear, authority, constriction, and I never heard anyone talk about what would be considered agapic love. Love for its own sake, love without strings. It was all to do with authority and all to do with obedience and fear of committing sin, lest you be condemned, even though the sins that you could go to hell for were incredibly minor. I mean, this created in me, let's say, as a 6 or 7-year-old learning about these things, terrible fear. Like I was doomed. How can you live a life where you don't go to hell because it's so easy to go to hell? Now, to me, that is an abuse. And that's an abuse of something that has forgotten about agape to a great extent.
Yeah. But how is that the same as greed?
Because the abuse has arisen out of those who want to take power, whether it's in terms of parenthood or is in terms of hierarchy, whatever it may be. Power and authority takes the place that it should not have in human life and represses the notion that people should find their way to expand, find their values, and follow them.
Now, as I recall, in Peirce's essay about the greed of the 19th century, he even used the phrase, I might be wrong, but I believe he used the phrase that people in that era had come to see greed as a good thing.
Yes, he was saying that. He called it the philosophy of greed, which says that if you follow your own self-interest, and he had identified this with Darwinian approach to evolution, if you follow your own self-interest, that'll be to the good of everyone. Everyone will profit from that. That
idea, as far as I know, was enunciated most clearly by Adam Smith, the philosopher of capitalism, in the, I guess it would have been the 18th century, in which he talked about the invisible hand, that when everybody pursues their own economic self-interest, the entire society benefits economically.
Yes, and we see that is not true. And we see that is the very definition of greed, and that's, in my opinion, the great accomplishments of the human race have been a result of agape, and the great horrors and destructiveness and the pernicious acts that the human race has been able to do are the result of greed. Eros without conscience.
Eros without conscience. In other words, I want it all. I want it all now.
There is no conscience because the conscience of Eros is agape and it's gone. Yeah.
Satisfy me more and more and more.
That's right.
In fact, I know you quote a passage from Key Largo in which a gangster is talking and saying, what do you want? I want more.
That's right. That's exactly right. It's a marvelous scene. But Edward G. Robinson's the gangster. You couldn't get him any better than that. And it's Humphrey Bogart who says this about him. Edward G. Robinson is asked, what do you want anyway? Like they're discovering what he's trying to manipulate there. And he says, well, I want, and he doesn't really have an answer. And Bogart comes in and said, I know what it is. You want more. He says, yeah, that's it. I want more. I really want more. And Lionel Barrymore says, and you will never get enough, will you, Rocco? And he says, we'll never have. No, I guess I won't. To me, that's a terrific statement of greed. More, because it's insatiable. Greed is insatiable. Eros without restraint, you just want to enhance yourself more and more and more.
And on the other hand, with just a little bit of agape, that can be a positive thing.
Of course. This is the desire to be enhanced, the desire to grow and evolve that Eros contains is very important for life. Absolutely. It's just the losing of agape. And this is why when I see, for instance, in the news, when I see people who really are showing love and loving concern for each other, I mean, It stands out these days, in the news, as compared to the news of people who are trying to manipulate and overcome each other, divide from each other, put each other down. So agape is the key. Agape is the answer.
Well, that's quite profound, Adam Crabtree. I hope the message gets spread far and wide.
Thank you. I do too.
Thank you so much for being with me.
Well, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed this.
And thank you for being with us.